Thank you very much for being here. My name is Monty Adkins. I'm a researcher at the University of Huddersfield. I'm in the music department. But as Annika said, much of my work crosses over between, or is interested in, the relationship between painting, photography, and sculpture, and sound art. Many of my PhD students look at, I suppose we could call it, the creative misuse of kind of art theory, photographic theory, and how that feeds into developing new forms of sonic art. And today I wanted to talk about two things in particular. One deals with sonification, which I will talk about at the end. And the first is the relationship about, I suppose, about kind of the use of space and three-dimensional sound space, and how looking at past practitioners, including people like Hepworth and composers like Xenakis and Stockhausen, actually enables us to think about form in a different way. Sound spatialization has been an integral part of electronic music right from its very inception. Composers like John D. Harrison, Conrad Burma, and Ludger Brummer have often talked about sound spatialization as the kind of fairy dust on top of electronic sound composition. It's actually very difficult for us to perceive more than one or two movement trajectories in space at any given time. And I'm sure when we go to the cinema, we're all used to the kind of whoosh-bang effect that Hollywood films have, but actually making sound movement an integral part of formal thinking in sound is relatively new and quite difficult to actually convincingly do for a listener. Nevertheless, right from the very beginning, on the left-hand side here, you have Pierre Schaeffer, who is often considered to be the grandfather of electronic music. He mainly worked in France, in the GRM, which was the Groupe de Recherche Musicale, actually set up during the Nazi occupation of France, but essentially came to fruition in about 1948, 1949. He and his engineer, Jacques Poulain, worked on what they called the potentiometer d'espace. Essentially, we're used to mixing desks, kind of changing volumes. What they wanted to do was to have a three-dimensional version of that, so you could actually physically move and the space would move. And here you see the first version Pierre Schaeffer worked with. So right from the very beginning, instead of just presenting sound in stereo, or mono as it was then, they set up a 5-channel system where you had 2 speakers in front of you, 1 behind, 1 above you, and if you think stereo recordings with Columbia Records came out in 1948, and the very same year Pierre Schaeffer was already talking about spatial sound. Interestingly, the 5th channel, you can see Schaeffer controlling, and that was the one that actually moved, and they were able to move the sound between the speakers. Now, this was very much considered as a kind of artistic expansion of what musique concrète could do, the idea of working with sound in three-dimensional space. But it was not until the 1970s with people like John Chowning that you started to see a real understanding of how psychoacoustics and different kinds of effects that you could apply in the studio using a computer could actually create trajectories of sound through space which were very controllable and went beyond just artistic practice and also beyond the speaker as a sound source. So with ambisonics, you can start and actually create sound that moves around the space regardless of where the speakers are. Now, one of the things that is particularly interesting and how this links to Hepworth is the use of trajectories and sound and, as I say later, sonification. There's 2 examples here that are quite key early on. Iannis Xenakis was a Greek composer. He was also an architect, expert draftsman like Hepworth, and he created the Philips Pavilion in 1958. On the right-hand side, you see Stockhausen at the Osaka World Fair. These 2 World Fair exhibitions, 12 years apart, were real showcases for the use of spatial sound up to that point. Xenakis's, I mean, you can see certain kind of architectural thinking and kinship with some of the Hepworth sculptures that we've already looked at. This had 425 loudspeakers in it, and the audience walked through this three-dimensional space. Stockhausen's was a massive globe-type affair where people were actually in the middle of the space, and he was one of the first really to start looking at sound trajectories. Now, one of the things that I'm interested in is not just an artist or a musician's response to a particular work of art and how they express that in music. You think of someone like Rachmaninoff's Isle of the Dead, for example. What I'm more interested in is understanding the form or taking the structure of a work, piece of art, sculpture, and so on, and actually understanding the techniques and what is actually integral to the art and transforming that to inform formal thinking in a new piece of sonic art. So much more, not just an interpretation of, but much more detailed investigation. And one of the things that struck me that's particularly useful for sonification and also useful in thinking about spatial trajectory is when you start looking at the relationship between Hepworth's drawings and her sculptures. I'll go through a couple of slides here. This we've just seen. Red intention, form and movement. And then you start looking at the sketches of Ioannis Xenakis. A couple of years ago, there was a wonderful exhibition at the Drawing Room in New York of Xenakis' sketches, and they really started to reveal the kind of kinships in, I suppose, in modernist thinking around the times of the 1940s, mid-1950s, and in Xenakis' case, the integration of architectural and mathematical principles into his work. And like Hepworth, his work was more about, I suppose, the kinship is more about the kind of tension, the formal design, the abstract qualities, about the density and texture of a work, rather than traditional musical parameters like rhythm and melody. Here you can see an example from Metastasis, which is Xenakis literally drawing string glissandi trajectories. This is a slightly more detailed drawing of string trajectories through a mid-1950s piece called Pithopracta. These were all done using mathematical principles, and you can see very clearly kinships even later on. Obviously, there's a kind of, you look at the differences between the kind of strings and how Hepworth used that in her sculpture and the particular lines that Xenakis was able to draw. When we're looking even at later figures, Xenakis was using the UPIC system, which is a computer system that he developed in the 1970s. And again, there's a very clear conception around the use of spectral space. The diagram on the right actually represents the frequencies of sound. He very closely mapped that to the kind of spatial trajectory of sound when he did work in multi-channel rather than just stereo. So there's very much a kind of thinking about weight, density, the design and form of pieces that goes beyond traditional musical parameters here. Stockhausen, again, was working in a similar way in pieces like Octophonie, which deals with multiple spatial trajectories within a cube, even more elaborate, where you start to get spatial trajectories in cosmic pulses. He actually developed 241 individual spatial trajectories for 24 layers of sound. And here you can begin to see possible ways for thinking about how Hepworth's sculptures could actually be quite a fascinating stimulus for three-dimensional sound and thinking about spatialization. That actually goes beyond just the kind of abstract, here's a pattern, but thinking about how you can represent her sculptures and how her sculptures can be an influence for that particular type of thinking. This is the last slide, and perhaps where these things start and come together. At the Centre for Research in New Music, where I work, we have close connections with Kermit, which is not the frog. It's actually a research centre in Montreal, which is shared between the University of Montreal and the University of McGill. One of the things that Louis Comer has been doing with his fellow researchers is looking at the sonification of objects in space and how they can be perceived by blind people or people who are very visually impaired. And this strikes me as a particularly interesting aspect of research into how sound spatialization can have a very direct connection to both physical objects and also enable exhibits that are looking at three-dimensional objects, not just sculpture, but other aspects of kind of, museum technologies of understanding how essentially people who are visually impaired can go through these spaces and understand or gain a more insightful understanding of what is actually there rather than just audio or having an audio description. Now, this sonification that Louis has been doing is actually taking, at the moment, point cloud data of simple objects and being able to locate their, how big they are and locate them in a three-dimensional space. So far, he's been working with Francois Cote, who is actually blind, and they have been able to demonstrate quite clearly that we're able to perceive location in space, and we're able to perceive the density. And what we're not able to perceive so far, and they're still working on, is shape. But they're still working on that, and it is a particularly fascinating way of being able to think about the use of three-dimensional sound with regard to the representation of physical objects. So again, we're not just looking at the representation or an interesting artist response to. We're now getting to the stage where we're actually able to create sound art works that will actually respond and give a very clear indication of three-dimensional objects. So thinking about it in response to sculpture, as well as other physical objects that will allow blind people and visually impaired people access to things that we take for granted every day. So as you can see, whilst this talk is not necessarily about Hepworth, it is very interested in her work and its relationship to modernist thinking as it relates to contemporary sound practice, and particularly with regards to sonification, how three-dimensional sound can be used to illustrate such museum exhibits. Thank you very much.